Hey, so we're going to talk about weed, all right? I can see just by looking around, the other room, our competition, is discussing international education, which is a good topic in its own right, but it's not nearly as interesting, I don't think, as talking about investments in cannabis. So I can tell that everybody in here is exactly the kind of folks that I would have hung out with in high school. So we're skipping class and we're going to talk about weed. So up with me on stage is Rachel Farr. She's my partner at Messner Reeves. We're both in the corporate group there. I focus primarily on foreign direct investment. Rachel does a lot of corporate work and actually represents a publicly traded Canadian company that invests in cannabis in the United States. So Rachel also just got back from a cannabis conference in New Orleans, so I thought we'd take a minute just for her to fill you in on some of the trends that they see coming out of the industry that they talked about at that conference. So Rachel, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I just attended the Marijuana Business Journal Next conference in New Orleans. And that kind of, just by the location of that itself, it tells you one of the primary trends that we're seeing in both the hemp and cannabis industries is simply acceptance of it. I imagine, several years ago, a talk like this probably would not be at any conference like this, and it's come a very long way in a very short time. The numbers, especially in the United States, speak for themselves at this point. Over 90% of the country is in favor of medical cannabis. Even the most conservative news reporting is putting 59% of Americans in favor of adult use. So just the general trend across the country is acceptance of the industry, acceptance of adult use, and that's really what's going to be driving the business aspect of it forward. Kind of the second trend that came out of there, which is why we're here today, is the increased globalization of the trade itself, seeing how many countries across the world are kind of coming into their own in the cannabis industry. There are movements in Greece and Australia and Israel and Poland, and Canada, of course, is the main driving force at this point in time. And it's really the United States that I see at this point playing catch up. We're keeping ourselves out of that global market. And it's about figuring out ways to work internationally, move the politics forward in the U.S., and kind of engage globally.
Excellent, thanks. So with those trends in mind, let's talk a little bit about what investment in cannabis looks like. So we're in Colorado. Most people here are very familiar with the industry, or at least it's something that they're not surprised to see as they go down the street. Now, most people, when they think of the cannabis industry, are thinking of your friendly neighborhood dispensary, where people are buying joints and flowers and edibles and drinks and all kinds of cannabis consumable products, maybe even CBD oil, all kinds of things, cannabinoids that are for sale there. But that's really a relatively small portion of the entire industry. There are ancillary businesses as well, many that own real estate or intellectual property or equipment that's used in growing or processing cannabis, those sorts of things. There are a lot of businesses in the industry that never touch the plant. Now, their customers may be the folks who do touch the plant, but they never do. And so those are the kinds of players in the industry that really are solid targets for foreign investment. So maybe let's take a minute and think about why foreign investment. What does it do? I don't think we have to sell this room on the benefits of foreign direct investment in the United States. We're essentially using other people's money to employ Americans to grow our economy. In my practice, most of my clients are foreign firms that invest in the United States. Cannabis is just one slice of that, right? So it might be renewable energy or traditional energy or technology, or in this state, cannabis, in particular, some of the ancillary industries. So I don't know, Rachel, do you maybe want to talk a little bit about the process of representing a foreign company in investing in cannabis in the United States, maybe touch a little bit on the variations among different states that we have to deal with, those sorts of things?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of my cross-border experience in this industry is representing Canadian-listed publicly traded companies that are doing direct investment into various aspects of the cannabis industry in the United States. One in particular, in the past year alone, we have done deals in Colorado, New York, Florida, Vermont, Maryland, New Jersey, so I mean, it is a hot market right now, and there's a lot of money to be invested and a lot of money to be made at this point. The kind of extra level of difficulty that comes in with these deals always is that it requires an enormous amount of creativity, because you're working with your local level regulators, you're working with your state regulators, you're working with all the kind of standard M&A issues you need for any type of deal, no matter what industry, whether it's regulated or not, that you need. So we always tell people when they're going into this, and if they're looking to invest in it, you kind of need to start from scratch, kind of erase everything from your internal chalkboard as to how you do things, because you're just going to have to figure out a new path when you're working in this. We tell people all the time, they come to us with deals, say, we want to do X, Y, and Z. We have a buyer, we have a seller, and we say, that's great, that is also entirely illegal. If it was another industry, that'd be great, but it's not. So the number one requirement, we have is creativity, flexibility, and having an open mind as to how it's going to be structured. You see a lot of companies that are listing on the Toronto Exchange simply because it is, nationally legal there, and you have the ability to have access to those sort of capital markets there. And, companies are raising millions and millions of dollars overnight for these deals in the United States. So there's an incredible access to capital there. It's all going directly into these kind of state markets. We've done deals, how we structured in Colorado is real estate assets, and then sort of a indirect ownership in a grow. It's that kind of leads into a second trend, which is that at this point, seeing that it is federally still illegal in the U.S. and seeing as that it still falls under the Controlled Substances Act, each state has been left, or at least at this point has been left, to kind of figure it out for themselves. And what you're seeing is a lot of inconsistency among the states. So there has to be an understanding that, if you want to be doing a deal in Colorado, if you want to be doing a deal in California, they're going to be entirely different. So just keeping on top of changes in regulations, changes in policies, and just kind of keeping a pulse on the industry itself is really important in, figuring out how you're going to invest and in what.
Exactly. So we focused so far on foreign investment in the United States. And, that poses its own set of challenges that Rachel just laid out. But we've got our neighbor to the north that is about to legalize, really fully implement legalization of recreational use of cannabis. Looks like it's going to be this fall. Mm-hmm. It'll certainly be before the next elections in Canada, but it looks like implementation is going to happen this fall. There are a limited number of licenses for growers, for processors. Each province has their own laws on distribution and sales. So the Canadian marketplace is really not unlike the United States marketplace, frankly. And while in Canada, you can use the capital markets, sort of publicly traded companies to consolidate capital to be able to make these kind of investments, it's much tougher for Americans to be able to do that because of the legal status that cannabis has in this country. So Americans, if we are going to invest in the Canadian cannabis industry, are going to have to be a little bit more creative and sort of look at private sourcing of capital to be able to invest north of the border. This is, I think, particularly true of Colorado. We're widely viewed in the industry as a place where we've got our act together. It's a more mature industry here, even though we sometimes feel like it's still the Wild West a little bit. We don't quite know what the rules are going to be. We don't always know when changes are going to come down, how this is going to impact our clients. We've gotten used to that, and Colorado is pretty good at how we regulate this industry and where we're going moving forward. So actually, Colorado is looked to as a bit of a leader in this industry. So for the folks who are looking at, investing in Canada from Colorado, it actually helps to be from here, rather than your traditional venture capital spots, right? So Silicon Valley or Boston or New York is great in the tech industry. I have a feeling, can't confirm it with a whole lot of data yet, but I have a feeling that Colorado is going to have that prestige advantage in the cannabis industry, at least in investments moving forward, because there's a lot of institutional knowledge here about how to do it and do it right, and do it in a way that is compliant with our legal obligations. And we understand that, there's risk involved, but we try as best we can to de-risk as much as possible by making sure that we're in compliance with what's going on, whatever the regulatory environment might be. So that's all a long way of saying, I think we're going to see an advantage for Colorado capital in investing in cannabis overseas. Now, there are some hurdles that we're going to have to overcome in that, just based on our own law. But there's almost always a way to make things happen if we just think about it long enough, and if we work with regulators enough to make it actually work. So that said, we've talked a lot about the U.S. and Canada and the industries there. It's not the only place in the world where we see the cannabis industry thriving. I mean, Rachel, you mentioned Poland. Poland is the source of a lot of industrial hemp that's imported into the United States. Yes, you can import industrial hemp. Sometimes you run into issues with overzealous customs agents, but it is entirely possible to import the product. We can talk a little bit more about hemp and CBD and recreational and medical marijuana and the particular issues that come up in a Q&A. So Rachel, unless you have something else to add to the sort of general discussion, I'd like to open it up to the audience.
Yeah, I just had kind of one
Please.
closing point on top of, saying that Colorado is really looked to as a leader in the cannabis industry, which is something I absolutely agree with. Just to build on that, this is obviously an industry, more so than any other industry that I've worked in, that is built on relationships, which makes a lot of sense if you think about where it was 30 years ago, and you had to trust your drug dealer. That's just the nature of the industry. It's where it came from. So Colorado, legalizing relatively on the early side in 2010 with medical, we've had that much longer to establish, relationships, not only with people who are being brought over from the black market into the fully legal market, but just establishing the relationships, with legal and with banking to the extent we can do it, and the ancillary services and things like that. So it's, it is to our benefit to have been in this industry early, start creating those relationships, because as soon as it does go federally legal, which, it will at some point in time, we're really primed to be in a good spot, not only for kind of national investment, but for going, belatedly joining the global market.
Excellent. Okay, what are your questions about weed? Don't be shy. This is a safe space. Here we go. Yes, sir. Sorry, I've got lights in my eyes, so if I miss you, that's why. Please.
All right. I want to talk compliance really quick. I think and it's probably a really simple question, but I just wanted to hear your opinion on it.
Sure.
How do you feel as it becomes more accepted, as you talked about, and eventually, I think we all can be very confident that eventually it'll be rescheduled.
Yeah.
Do you foresee compliance becoming more tricky? Should the federal government start, being a little bit more lax about it, or do you see it becoming a little bit more streamlined across the country and eventually outside of the country as well?
Good question. Rachel, do you want to take the first crack at it, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I'll start with just the national component of it, which would be, the way that I think about it is similar to, and where we want to get it to is the way liquor is regulated. We have the federal regulations, it's clearly federally legal, and then the states have kind of, been left to work it out the best they can, and over time, there has been, kind of increasing consistency among state laws, but there are always those weird outliers. We have Pennsylvania's liquor laws hanging in there. So I don't see compliance being negatively affected by that. I see it becoming more highly regulated, which I see as a very good thing. Yeah. Compliance is very much at the forefront of kind of the industry movers at this point. Kind of at the conference I was at last week, I met with a woman who runs a import-export compliance business, who's, been around for 30 years and is just now getting into cannabis because she sees those issues arising. So it's definitely at the forefront of people's minds. I think nationally, when it becomes federally legal, it's only going to help.
Yeah.
And it's going to, we're sort of separating the wheat from the chaff over the years as to the people who want to have a black market business on the legal market. They're starting to fall away, and we're going to be left with those people who really want to treat it like a legitimate industry.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. And the analogy with the liquor industry, I think, is apt. That's really probably where we're headed. Now, there's one caveat, and that is with medical use of THC, but also with CBD, I think you're going to see some complications that come in with regard to, if the FDA says that CBD is legal as a drug to treat epilepsy, what does that do to CBD oil that maybe you can buy at Whole Foods as over the counter? We start to get into food and drug law that may impact medical cannabis as well. So I think we'll see some complications, some issues that we need to work through, but having really the biggest issue is making it rescheduling cannabis so that we don't necessarily have the federal illegality. Once everybody is on board, everybody's rowing sort of in the same direction. Yes, there will be complications, but right now the complication is you go to prison in theory. So I'd rather eliminate that complication and deal with whatever regulatory hurdles sort of come up. What other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, what is the latest on gaining access to banking services either here in Colorado or in other states?
Good luck. A lot of folks have tried with credit unions and different things. I'm hearing some rumblings in the political sector that we may see a bill coming through the Senate that essentially says, notwithstanding marijuana's status as a Schedule I narcotic, in those states that have decided to legalize the drug for medicinal or recreational purposes, if someone is in compliance with their state law, banking regulations and tax regulations don't apply to that industry. So that helps with with the banking of the industry, and it can become less of an all-cash industry. It also might make research a little bit easier. We deal with some of the tax issues that they face. So if that bill makes it through the Senate, which I think it probably has 60 votes to do, and Paul Ryan allows for a vote in the House, and President Trump signs it, that could go quite a ways to dealing with the banking issue. But I think ultimately that's a political fix. We've got some, private sector attempts to try to work around it, mostly through credit unions, I think. But Rachel, I don't know if you've got anything to add to the discussion.
Yeah, that's the one area of the industry that has been the most frustrating over the past several years, and I feel like has made the least advancement. There are the credit unions. Colorado made an attempt, to put something in place where you could have cannabis-specific credit unions, and then it was blocked by the feds, and that's moving its way through the courts as we speak. Protracted and not sure what the outcome of that is going to be. There are a lot of people trying creative solutions for, payment processing and things like that for, dispensaries and for ancillary services taking funds from businesses that do touch the plants. Not how sure those are compliant with banking laws, but people are trying. People are being creative and trying to find solutions around it. But that's definitely the most frustrating thing that is dealt with. Particularly in states where it is legal, you do sometimes see bigger banks allowing those accounts. Inevitably, when National finds out, they're shut down. But people who are involved in this industry have just gotten very used to opening an account, having it shut down, moving it to another bank, and just repeating all over. But
Yeah, I'm not
fingers
sure
crossed
that
that better solution
exactly.
is coming.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Sir? Sorry, I'm biased to people front and center that I can see. So if we'll talk about more questions after this one. Yes, sir.
My question's not very specific, but it's my general interest is more on the public health side of cannabis use. Specifically, some questions come to mind regarding the edibles and like kind of the packaging. Like when I've gone into stores that sell cannabis products, like it looks like a candy shop, you know?
Yeah, it's great.
And so, concern comes to mind with more younger people getting a hold of those. And also kind of people generally not understanding the latency of edibles, like as far as like, I'm gonna eat this, I don't feel anything, I feel fine. Then they get in the car, then it hits them, and then they're driving stoned. So I'm just kind of curious from an industry's point of view of like what sort of directions do you guys want to go? Like what sort of things, like would you consider like kind of walking back some of like the beautiful cheesecake packaging and maybe have that less visible, so when it goes out in the store, like the adult that knows that it's cheesecake is fine with it, but on the packaging it doesn't look so appealing to a younger person. So that's kind of my general thought.
Yeah, and that's a good question. So one of the best parts about being in Colorado and looked to as an industry leader from a state regulatory perspective is that we've had the most time to learn from the mistakes in the regulations. And over time, one of the main problems that has come up is packaging and shapes of edibles and things like that. And Colorado over the years has had increasingly strict regulations as to, particularly with edibles, because you have that issue that you pointed out, being appealing to children, having a latency, and, once that latency hits, not being able to do anything about it, basically. So edibles can no longer be shaped like, cartoons, fruit, anything that resembles food. It has to be just a geometric shape. It has to be stamped with THC on it. So the product itself is a little more obvious that it's, not candy and not something that's appealing to children, kind of taking out the Joe Camel aspect of it. There are very strict regulations with respect to child-proof packaging, which a lot of companies take to the extreme and just make it impossible to open, which I think is great. So Colorado over the years has learned from the mistakes and say, hey, we started where we thought was a good place, find that we have these problems, let's address it in the regs. So it is evolving all the time. Haven't heard much about evolving the packaging, so it's less appealing, particularly in the rec market, because only people 21 and over are in the store and they want to, have good marketing that way, but yeah. Yeah.
Approaches like engaging with corporations. Oh yeah, but yeah, like when the corporations will be engaging in public health efforts.
Yeah.
Like from intrinsic.
Yeah.
Yep. No, I think the industry recognizes that it has a public health concern, that there are public health issues. Let's just say a couple of things about it. One, you do have to be of age to go into the store. Secondly, so the only people that would be exposed are those who have children at home, most likely, which is the same concern we have with alcohol, that kids at home might not understand what a Jack Daniel's, I don't know, or some kind of a wine cooler in the fridge isn't juice. So we've got that issue. Now, I think the parents of children have an interest. I see you, man. We're almost done. The parents of children have an interest in, of course, making sure that their kids are safe. And let's be real, that stuff is expensive. You don't want to waste it. So there's an economic argument too. I will close by saying that Canada, while cannabis is going to be legalized nationally in the fall, that does not include edibles because they don't feel comfortable that they've got the regulatory structure that they want to have in place in order to make edibles legal. So that's going to be a next step for the Canadians. So I think that's to your point, that there are some public health concerns with these things. So Thank you all for listening to us jabber about cannabis a little bit. We'll be around, probably outside, to answer questions, and then we'll also be here for the happy hour. So anybody who's got questions about weed, you know where to go. Thanks.
Thank you.